Hi everyone, welcome to Azad Revenge Stories channel. The night my family abandoned my grandmother at my shabby apartment door. They thought they were dumping their final burden onto their backup daughter. They had no idea the silent woman in that rusted wheelchair remembered every lie, every signature, and every time they traded our blood for cash. They never expected that the door they slammed shut that night would soon become the exact weapon to bury their years of hidden secrets forever. My name is Claire Walsh, and by the time I turned 29 years old, I had already mastered the bitter art of living on the absolute edge of nothing. I rent a cramped, drafty apartment in South Dayton, Ohio, a place where the winter wind howls through the window cracks and the ancient heater groans like a dying animal. I spend my daylight hours trapped under the blinding sterile fluorescent lights at a medical data entry center called Norval Health Processing. For 8 long hours a day, I sit in a gray cubicle staring at glowing computer screens and typing billing codes until my fingers cramp and my vision blurs. But the grind does not end there. When the clock strikes 5 in the evening, I trade my office badge for a stained apron, rushing across town to a greasy family diner. I work the evening shift, wiping down sticky vinyl booths, carrying heavy trays of fried food, and serving watery coffee to tired truck drivers. I do all of this just to chip away at a massive mountain of debt from a college degree I never even got the chance to finish. Every single dollar I earn has a designated destination, days before it ever hits my checking account. There is no safety net. There is only the constant, exhausting treadmill of sheer survival. In the grand, unspoken hierarchy of the Walsh family, I was never the priority. From the time I was a little girl, I was the child they remembered only when it was convenient and completely forgot when it was not. My older brother, Nalan, was the golden boy. He was the investment, the undisputed pride of the bloodline. Nalan received the praise, the financial backing for his business ventures, the loud applause at every minor milestone. I, on the other hand, only received tight-lipped nods of approval when I was sacrificing my own needs to make things easier for the rest of them. I was the built-in backup plan, the reliable beast of burden they never wanted to acknowledge until they found themselves falling. Then there was my grandmother, Grandma Lorraine Walsh. Almost exactly 1 year ago, a sudden, massive stroke tore through her life, stealing her voice and the mobility on the right side of her body. Before the stroke, she was sharp, observant, a quiet but formidable force in our family. After the hospital finally released her, my parents and Nolan practically held a living funeral for a woman who was still breathing. They began referring to her in the past tense. They told everyone she was gone, declaring she was just an empty shell incapable of understanding the world around her. They eagerly stripped her of her personhood because dealing with a complex disabled human being was far too inconvenient for their pristine, carefully curated lives. The turning point happened on a freezing, rain-soaked Tuesday night. I had just gotten home from a grueling double shift at the diner. My cheap canvas shoes were soaked all the way through to my socks, and my hair smelled heavily of old frying oil and pure exhaustion. I had barely taken off my coat when my cell phone rang. It was my mother. Her voice was clipped, breathless, devoid of any normal maternal warmth. She offered no greeting, no inquiry about my day. She simply stated that they were bringing Grandma over to my place, forcefully insisting it would just be for a few weeks while they sorted out some issues. I tried to argue. I tried to frantically explain that I had another morning shift the very next day, that my apartment was practically the size of a walk-in closet, and that I had absolutely no resources. She hung up the phone before I could even form a complete sentence of protest. Less than 1 hour later, the harsh glare of headlights cut through the heavy rain outside my living room window. I pulled open my peeling front door to find the three of them standing on my narrow concrete walkway. My father, my mother, and Nalan were hurriedly hauling Grandma Lorraine out of the back seat of their luxury sedan. They pushed her rusted, squeaking wheelchair over my threshold, carelessly dumping 2 battered, scuffed suitcases and a wrinkled plastic grocery bag full of prescription medicine bottles directly onto my faded rug. They did not even bother to take off their heavy winter coats. They remained inside my apartment for less than 3 minutes total. My mother cast a deeply disgusted look around my cramped living room, her eyes critically darting over the second-hand furniture, the peeling wallpaper, and the water stain spreading across the ceiling. She adjusted her expensive silk scarf, letting out a heavy sigh, and offered me a sickeningly condescending smile. She told me I always had such a soft heart, and therefore I was naturally suited for the grim task of caring for the elderly. It was a thinly veiled, cruel way of saying my life was already worthless enough to easily absorb this massive new burden. Before my exhausted brain could even begin to process the sheer magnitude of what was happening, my father stepped forward. He shoved a crumpled, poorly photocopied stack of insurance papers directly into my chest, forcing me to grab them. The pages were incredibly vague, missing crucial contact numbers and policy details. I looked frantically over at my brother, desperately hoping for some shred of logic or basic human decency. Nalim stood hovering near the doorway, shifting his weight from foot to foot, entirely avoiding Grandma's eyes. He looked at the floor, the walls, the doorknob. He looked everywhere except at the woman who had helped raise him. He treated her as if she were nothing more than a highly overdue, annoying bill he was trying to dodge. Without offering a single word of instruction regarding her routine, without asking if I had enough food in the fridge or medical supplies in the bathroom, they practically fled the scene. The heavy wooden door clicked shut behind them, sounding like a gunshot in the quiet room. I rushed over to the front window and watched in disbelief as their sleek, dark sedan sped away into the stormy night, leaving red tail lights blurring rapidly in the heavy downpour. Panic immediately clamped down heavily on my chest, hot, tight, and completely suffocating. I was furious. I was terrified. I mentally scanned my bank balances. I did not even have enough money left in my checking account to buy a decent, supportive bed for myself, let alone afford the highly specialized daily care, the soft food diet, and the constant monitoring that an elderly stroke survivor absolutely required. I was drowning, and my family had just thrown an anchor directly at my head. I turned around slowly, my breathing shallow and fast. Grandma Lorraine was sitting perfectly still in her worn-out wheelchair in the exact center of my tiny living room. She did not attempt to make a single sound. She just slowly tilted her head back, looking up at the gray, water-damaged ceiling of my apartment, quietly taking in the dreary, depressing reality of the place where she had just been abandoned. I stood frozen, waiting for her to cry or show anger. Instead, she slowly reached out with her good, functioning left hand. She placed her frail, cold fingers gently over my trembling wrist. It was a firm, grounding, and deliberate touch in that chaotic, terrifying moment. It felt exactly like she was the one comforting me, acknowledging the massive injustice we were both currently trapped in. That very first night brutally set the tone for our new reality together. Having absolutely no other furniture, I was forced to drag my only mattress completely off its metal frame. I pushed it directly onto the hard wooden floor, wedging it safely into the corner of the room next to the wall. I gathered every spare blanket, old towel, and flat pillow I owned, folding them meticulously to construct a makeshift soft, sleeping corner for her upon the mattress. I plugged in an old flickering plastic nightlight near her head, so she would not wake up completely disoriented in total darkness. Once she was finally settled and breathing steadily, I lay down directly on the unforgiving, freezing floorboards a few feet away, wrapping myself in my winter coat for warmth, staring up at the shifting shadows dancing across the cracked paint on the wall. My mind raced relentlessly. I mentally tallied the terrifying, potentially bankrupting cost of her daily medications, wondering how many extra diner shifts I would have to beg the manager for just to afford her blood pressure pills. But right beneath that immediate financial terror, a much darker, sharper question kept gnawing away at the edges of my mind. My family was incredibly selfish, entirely self-centered, and relentlessly greedy. But they were never, ever careless. The sheer naked panic I had seen flashing in their eyes tonight did not make sense. The desperate, clumsy speed of their exit, the absolute refusal to look a disabled old woman in the face. It was all wrong. They did not just drop her off here tonight simply because they were tired of dealing with her. They were running from something. They were desperately trying to hide something massive, and they needed her quietly out of the way, locked inside my miserable little apartment to finally finish doing it. The first 21 days were nothing short of a brutal crash course in sheer survival. My tiny space transformed into a cramped, unsanitary medical ward. I had to beg the diner manager to shift my hours entirely to the late night weekends, severely cutting my income just to be present during the day. I learned the terrifying and heavy mechanics of dead weight. Every single transfer from her floor mattress to the rusted wheelchair felt like a terrifying high-wire act. My lower back screamed in constant agony, and my arms were bruised from gripping her too tightly out of fear she would slip. I lived in constant dread of hearing a sudden thud against the hardwood. My own sleep fractured into restless 15-minute intervals. I would jolt awake at 3:00 in the morning, holding my breath in the dark until I heard the faint rhythmic sound of her breathing from the corner. The family had written her off as a vacant shell, a broken machine taking up space, but they were entirely wrong. Grandma Lorraine was physically locked inside her own, failing body, yet her mind was as sharp as cut glass. She could not force the words past her paralyzed vocal cords, but her eyes missed absolutely nothing. She tracked my exhausted movements across the room. She noticed when I skipped eating dinner just to make sure she had fresh, soft vegetables mashed into her bowl because she could not speak. We slowly built a fragile bridge across the silence. It started with her good left hand resting on the small, wobbly folding table where we ate. We established a complex system without ever speaking a single word about it out loud. A single deliberate tap of her index finger against the wood meant she was thirsty or needed her mouth wiped. Two sharp, quick taps meant the stifling apartment air was too much. A silent request for me to crack the window and let the draft in. But the most important signal, the one that made my blood run cold the first time I understood it, was 3 heavy, consecutive strikes. 3 slow taps meant danger. 3 taps meant she did not believe a single word being said, or she did not trust the person we were discussing. The grim reality of her arrival truly set in on the 4th afternoon, when I finally found a spare hour to unpack the 2 scuffed suitcases they had dumped on my rug. I unzipped the cheap canvas, expecting to find the comforting, familiar items of a woman who had spent 7 decades accumulating a wealthy life. Instead, the contents felt like a sterile, hasty donation pile meant for a stranger. There were exactly 5 sets of faded, mismatched sweatpants, a few threadbare cotton shirts that smelled faintly of industrial detergent, her plastic prescription bottles, and a small cracked cardboard photo box that was almost entirely empty save for 3 loose photographs of landscapes. There was not a single piece of her signature pearl jewelry. No favorite classic books, no expensive cashmere sweaters, no sentimental knickknacks from the massive, sprawling estate she had lived in her entire adult life. It was utterly chilling to look at that pathetic pile of clothes on my bed. This was not a temporary stay while they sorted out legal issues. You do not pack for a temporary vacation by erasing all physical evidence of a person's history. They had systematically stripped her of her entire identity before tossing her away. They wanted her to be a nobody. This dark suspicion was confirmed every time my mother bothered to call my cell phone. The screen would light up on a random Tuesday afternoon. I would answer naively, hoping for a shred of maternal guilt or genuine concern for her own mother-in-law. Instead, her voice was always brisk, clinical, and completely devoid of warmth. She treated me like a low-level, incompetent nursing home employee. She never once asked if Grandma was lonely in my cramped apartment. She never asked if she missed her beautiful rose garden. My mother only cared about cold transactional metrics. Was the medical insurance still actively covering the expensive blood thinners? Was her paralyzed right hand showing any signs of sudden movement? And most disturbingly, was she lucid enough to hold a pen and sign legal documents? When I truthfully told her Grandma could barely hold a plastic spoon to feed herself, my mother would let out a heavy, distinct sigh. It sounded entirely like relief. She would then quickly end the call, claiming she had a charity gala to plan or a tennis match to attend. The deep anger I felt toward my parents was exhausting, a fire burning constantly in my chest. But it was heavily countered by the vivid childhood memories flooding back as I sat on the floor spoon-feeding my grandmother warm chicken broth. I remembered being exactly 10 years old, crying bitterly on the back porch because Nolan had purposely ruined my school science project. My father had stood over me, demanding I stop being so overly sensitive and to grow up. Grandma Lorraine had slipped out quietly through the screen door, sitting beside me on the cold concrete steps. She never told me to toughen up. She never told me to stop crying. She just wrapped her warm arm around my shaking shoulders and let me cry until I was completely empty. I remembered the crumpled $5 bills she would secretly press into my palm for school lunches, winking at me so my strict parents would not see she was spoiling me. She was the only person in that sprawling, wealthy, hollow house who actually saw me as a real human being rather than a disappointing, flawed accessory to the family image. The breaking point of my own brave facade happened during the middle of our second month together. A severe, violent thunderstorm rolled through the valley, knocking out the power grid for our entire crumbling city block. The apartment plunged into a deep, suffocating, terrifying darkness. The sudden silence from the broken refrigerator and the dead street lights pressed down on me, heavy and absolute. I fumbled blindly through my kitchen drawers, finally managing to find and light a single dying plastic flashlight. I placed it upright on the table between us. The weak beam cast long hollow shadows across her tired, lined face. The sheer terror of my financial situation, combined with the dark and the cold, finally cracked my ribs wide open. Without planning to, without thinking about maintaining a strong front, I just started talking to the empty room. I told her the ugly, terrifying truth. I confessed that my bank account was completely overdrawn by $40. I admitted that the diner manager was threatening to close the place down next month, and if I lost those nightly cash tips, we would be thrown out onto the freezing street within 3 weeks. I told her I could not afford her next refill of heart medication. I told her I was terrified, exhausted, and completely broken. I dropped my heavy head into my hands, crying silently, deeply ashamed that I was failing the only task I had been given. Then I felt a shift in the dark. Her cold, frail left hand slid slowly across the scratched plastic table. She clamped her bony fingers tightly over my trembling wrist with a surprising fierce strength I did not know she possessed. I gasped and lifted my head. In the dim, fading yellow beam of the flashlight, her eyes caught mine. The sharp, assessing, guarded look she usually carried was entirely gone. In its place was a profound, overwhelming softness, a deep well of understanding. She squeezed my hand again, pulling it slightly toward her chest, holding me there in the dark in that pitch-black freezing apartment. As the rain hammered against the thin glass window, everything shifted permanently inside my chest. The heavy, suffocating resentment I had carried since the night they dropped her off simply evaporated into the cold air. I was no longer an unpaid, bitter nurse trapped by a cruel family obligation. I was no longer the tragic backup daughter. I was a shield. I was finally guarding the single person in my entire bloodline who had ever loved me without a single condition. And I silently swore I would burn the rest of them to the ground before I let them hurt her again. Exactly 8 weeks passed before the heavy silence of my isolation was broken by an aggressive intrusion from the outside world. The knock on my apartment door was sharp and authoritative, a commanding sound entirely out of place from my crumbling, quiet hallway. When I turned the deadbolt and pulled the door open, the sight before me made my stomach twist into a tight, cold knot. My brother Nolan stood on my faded welcome mat. He wore a tailored charcoal gray suit that easily cost more than my entire year of rent, and in his hands he held a massive woven basket overflowing with exotic pears, out-of-season berries, and imported cheeses. But it was his face that truly terrified me. He was wearing a soft, generous, and entirely practiced smile. Growing up in our household, a smile from Nolan was never free. It was a high-stakes currency deployed exclusively when he was closing a massive deal or maneuvering his way out of a catastrophic mistake. He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, his expensive leather shoes clicking sharply against my uneven floorboards. The heavy, spicy scent of his designer cologne instantly overpowered the stale air of my living room. He set the heavy fruit basket on my scratched kitchen counter with a theatrical sigh. Leaning back as if we were old friends settling in for a casual catch-up, he started speaking in a low, measured tone, a voice meticulously crafted to sound comforting and reasonable. He spun a long, dizzying web of corporate jargon, talking endlessly about wealth management, market volatility, and the pressing need to restructure the family assets for the greater good of our collective future. He paced back and forth across the narrow space, casually waving his hands, emphasizing that the unfortunate medical reality of our grandmother meant we all had to move incredibly fast. He painted a desperate picture of a crumbling family estate, needing his steady, brilliant hand to guide it safely through an incoming financial storm. I stood frozen by the sink, listening to the smooth, hypnotic cadence of his voice. He never once looked in the direction of the corner where Grandma Lorraine sat. To him, she was completely invisible, just another broken piece of furniture taking up space. I let him talk for 10 solid minutes before I finally gathered the nerve to cut through the thick, suffocating layer of his polished nonsense. I crossed my arms, stared directly into his confident eyes, and asked him flatly if all this grand talk just meant they needed her to sign a piece of paper. For a fraction of a second, his charismatic mask slipped. Nolan blinked, his jaw tightening as his calculated rhythm hit a solid brick wall. He shifted his weight defensively, quickly clearing his throat before launching into a rapid defensive tirade about incredibly complex legal procedures and the heavy burden of his fiduciary responsibility. He tried aggressively to make it sound as though he was doing the two of us a massive favor, shielding us from the ugly, stressful realities of the probate court system. But while he was frantically trying to regain the conversational high ground, my eyes darted over his shoulder to the corner of the room. Grandma Lorraine sat perfectly rigid in her chair. Her eyes were locked onto the side of Nolan's head with a terrifying, piercing intensity. Slowly and deliberately, she raised her left hand. She brought her knuckles down hard against the wooden armrest of her wheelchair. 1, 2, 3. The dull, heavy thuds echoed just beneath the sound of my brother's rambling excuses. 3 strikes. The ultimate warning. The absolute confirmation that every single syllable falling from his mouth was a poisonous trap. Nolan left shortly after my refusal to engage further, leaving behind the untouched basket of fruit and a suffocating aura of impending disaster. Less than 24 hours later, the second phase of their coordinated attack began. My inbox chimed with a new email from my mother. There was no polite greeting, no inquiry about my health. The message contained a single attached file, a scanned copy of a highly dense legal document. The body of her email was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive manipulation. She casually suggested that if I proved myself to be a reasonable team player and facilitated the necessary legal transitions, the family would be incredibly grateful. She even dangled the vague, insulting promise of a small monthly cash stipend to help offset my mounting caregiving expenses. It was a blatant bribe, thinly veiled as maternal support. I sat at my kitchen table for 2 straight hours, squinting at the glowing screen of my phone, reading every single line of that scanned document. It was framed as an updated version of a durable power of attorney, but the language was deliberately slippery and incredibly vague. As I waited through the dense paragraphs, my heart began to pound heavily against my ribs. Tucked away on the 4th page was a terrifyingly broad clause. It was explicitly designed to bypass standard medical proxy limitations and immediately legalize total unrestricted access to a massive, previously hidden private investment portfolio registered entirely in Grandma Lorraine's name. They did not want the authority to manage her failing healthcare. They wanted the absolute keys to the kingdom, and they desperately needed my physical proximity to her to force those gates wide open. When my phone rang later that afternoon, I knew exactly who was on the other end. My mother did not even bother saying hello. She immediately demanded to know if I had printed the document and secured the signature. I told her no. I told her I would not put a pen anywhere near her hand under any circumstances. The line went dead quiet for 3 long seconds before the inevitable explosion. My mother shrieked through the receiver, her voice turning shrill, vicious, and completely unhinged. She called me an ungrateful child, a stubborn, small-minded fool who was deliberately sabotaging the family out of petty, lifelong jealousy. She ranted aggressively about my financial failures, my lack of vision, and how I was selfishly holding the entire bloodline hostage. For 29 years, I had absorbed that exact tone of voice. I had always lowered my head, apologized profusely, and shrunk away into the background just to keep the peace. But standing in my miserable apartment, looking at the silent woman who had tapped 3 times to protect me, I felt a sudden, freezing calm wash over my entire body. I did not yell back. I did not attempt to defend my character. Right in the absolute middle of my mother screaming that I was a massive disappointment, I simply pulled the phone away from my ear and pressed the red button to end the call. The sudden dial tone in the room was the loudest, most powerful sound I had ever created in my entire life. That evening, the atmosphere in the apartment was vibrating with unsaid things. I was pacing the floorboards, restless and fueled by the residual adrenaline from the hostile phone call. Grandma Lorraine motioned aggressively for me to come closer. She pointed her trembling finger toward the smaller of the 2 scuffed suitcases sitting in the corner, the one we had barely touched since the night she arrived. I brought it over to her lap, unzipping the frayed black fabric. She reached inside, her hand shaking slightly as she bypassed the folded shirts and felt along the bottom lining. With a sudden, sharp pull, she ripped a small seam near the corner. From the hidden cavity, she extracted a tiny object tightly wrapped in a soiled embroidered cotton handkerchief. She placed the bundle on the small table and slowly peeled back the layers of fabric. Resting in the center was a small, heavy brass key. It was etched with a series of faded numbers, entirely unremarkable to anyone who did not know its true purpose. She picked it up and pushed it across the small distance between us, forcing it directly into my palm. Her cold fingers curled tightly over mine, trapping the heavy metal against my skin. She looked up at me, her eyes burning with a desperate, urgent fire. She did not need to speak a single word for me to understand the massive weight of what she was handing over. Her unblinking gaze screamed the silent warning loud and clear. Do not trust a single one of them. I looked down at the brass key, the cold metal biting into my palm, and the terrifying reality of my situation finally crystallized into absolute clarity. My family had not dumped a sick relative on my doorstep because they were overwhelmed. They did not view her as a mother, a grandmother, or even a living human being anymore. To them, she was nothing more than a breathing, stubborn steel safe that they had not yet figured out how to crack open. It took exactly 3 days of relentless, quiet searching to figure out what the heavy brass object belonged to. The metal was cold, worn smooth from years of handling, and etched with a faint series of numbers along the spine. During my 30-minute lunch break from the medical processing center, I sat in my rusted sedan and typed those numbers into my phone, cross-referencing them with local institutions. The search results pointed me directly to a small unassuming branch of Rivermark Savings. It was an older established bank located on the affluent side of the city, a place where the lobby smelled of polished mahogany and old money. It was the exact kind of institution where someone would quietly store their most valuable secrets. I walked through the heavy glass doors of the bank on a Tuesday afternoon, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. I approached the teller counter, sliding the brass item across the smooth marble surface. I knew perfectly well that I did not possess a single shred of legal authority to open whatever secure box this belonged to. I had no power of attorney, no legal guardianship paperwork, nothing but a creeping sense of dread. So I played the role of the naive, helpful granddaughter. I smiled nervously, explaining that I was simply checking on the status of my disabled grandmother's accounts to ensure her affairs were in order. The teller, a stern woman with sharp glasses, picked up the item and typed a long sequence into her computer. She stared at the screen for an agonizingly long time. When she finally looked back up at me, her expression was guarded, but incredibly revealing. She stated clearly that she absolutely could not grant me physical access to the vault area. However, she leaned forward, lowering her voice to a near whisper, and confirmed that the box was indeed active and remained solely under the legal ownership of Grandma Lorraine. Then the teller offered a piece of information that made the blood freeze in my veins. She casually mentioned that it was quite strange I was asking, considering a tall, well-dressed man had been standing at this exact counter less than 48 hours ago. The man, whom she described as aggressive and highly impatient, had been demanding to know the exact security protocols for accessing a disabled relative's safe deposit box without their physical presence or consent. He had been turned away, but he had promised to return with the necessary legal force. I thanked the teller, took the brass item back, and walked out into the blinding afternoon sun with my hands shaking uncontrollably. The investigation did not stop at the bank. Back at the cramped apartment, my perception of my daily routine sharply shifted. I started paying intense clinical attention to the daily mail delivery. Previously, I had just tossed the junk mail onto the kitchen counter without a second glance. Now I examined every single piece of paper. Slowly a disturbing pattern emerged. Several thick manila envelopes bearing the letterheads of prominent local law firms and financial institutions began appearing in my rusted mailbox. They looked incredibly battered. The fronts of the envelopes were plastered with layers of bright yellow forwarding stickers. By tracing the dates and addresses on those stickers, I realized these important documents had originally been mailed to my parents' sprawling house. From there, they had been deliberately forwarded to a sterile anonymous post office box across town. It was only through a sheer miraculous clerical error by the Postal Service that these letters had eventually bounced back and been rerouted to my grim apartment address. They were desperately trying to intercept her mail. One particular envelope sent from a county tax assessment firm had a slightly torn flap. I carefully slid the crisp white pages out and spread them across my faded rug. The document was a dense labyrinth of property tax liabilities and municipal codes. But the crucial piece of information hidden in the second paragraph hit me with the force of a physical blow. The massive, beautiful estate that Grandma Lorraine had lived in for over 40 years had been legally transferred to a new owner. It had not been listed on the open market. It had not been sold through a traditional real estate broker. Instead, the deed had been transferred for a sum so ridiculously, insultingly low that it was essentially a direct gift. I scanned down to the exact date of the legal transfer. The ink swam before my eyes. The official change of ownership had been filed exactly 14 days before her massive, debilitating stroke. I sat on the floor, the cold draft from the window chilling my skin, and forced myself to map out the timeline. I cast my mind back to the previous year. Right around that exact same time, during those tense, awful family dinners I was occasionally forced to attend, Nala and my father had been relentlessly bragging. They had been aggressively pursuing a massive multi-million-dollar commercial real estate venture downtown. They had been sweating, desperate for a massive injection of upfront capital to secure the development rights. They had practically begged every wealthy contact they knew. Then, miraculously, and without any logical explanation, they suddenly secured the funding and closed the deal. The timeline was not just a passing coincidence. It was a glaring, flashing neon sign pointing directly toward a monumental theft. I needed to poke the bear to see how it would react. I walked into the narrow hallway, putting 2 doors between myself and the living room so Grandma would not hear my voice, and I dialed my father's cell phone number. When he answered, I kept my tone incredibly light, playing the role of the confused, overwhelmed daughter. I casually mentioned that I had received some strange tax mail forwarded to my apartment regarding the old family house, and I asked him if he knew anything about a recent sale. The reaction I received was instantaneous, violent, and utterly terrifying. His tone shifted from bored indifference to explosive defensive rage in 0.5 seconds. He did not offer a single logical explanation. He did not try to gently correct a misunderstanding. Instead, he raised his voice, his words dripping with pure venom. He viciously told me that I simply did not have the intellectual capacity to understand complex adult money matters. He ordered me to immediately throw the mail into the garbage and to mind my own miserable business. He threatened that if I kept digging into things that did not concern me, I would regret it. His disproportionate, aggressive rage told me absolutely everything I needed to know. I had blindly thrown a dart in the dark and hit the exact center of a deeply bruised, highly guarded nerve. But suspicion was not enough. I needed hard, undeniable proof. I remember an old high school friend named Sarah who currently worked as a clerk down at the county recorder office. I swallowed my pride, called her, promised her a month of free coffees, and begged for a quiet off-the-books favor. I asked her to pull the public transfer records for the estate address. 2 days later, my phone chimed with a heavily encrypted file sent from Sarah's personal email. I opened the PDF file while sitting at my wobbly kitchen table. The official deed transfer for the property loaded onto my screen. The house had not been sold to a young family or a standard property management firm. It had been quietly and efficiently deeded over to a newly formed limited liability company. The name of the company was Walden Crest Redevelopment. My eyes darted rapidly down the page, scanning the fine print of the corporate registry details attached to the deed. And there it was, printed in stark black and white ink, a permanent public record of their absolute greed. The primary operator, the sole managing director holding total executive control of the company, was Nolan Walsh. My father was listed neatly on the second page as a senior strategic advisor, shielding himself from direct legal liability while still keeping his hands firmly in the pot. The golden boy of the Walsh family, the untouchable prodigy who could do no wrong, was standing dead center in a massive, coordinated, and highly illegal scheme. The final pieces of the puzzle locked together with a sickening, heavy crunch inside my mind. The brutal, exhausting reality of my current life was not an accident of fate. My family had not shown up at my door in the freezing rain because they were emotionally overwhelmed by the tragic medical reality of a disabled relative. They had not dumped her on my faded rug because they were desperate and out of options. They were incredibly, ruthlessly methodical. They had dumped Grandma Elrain in my tiny, disconnected, impoverished world because they desperately needed a cheap, secure, and completely invisible storage unit to hide her in. They needed her entirely out of the public eye. They needed her completely isolated from her lifelong friends, her nosy neighbors, and most importantly, her former legal counsel. They needed her locked away in the dark while they frantically scrubbed the financial evidence clean and systematically liquidated everything she had spent an entire lifetime building. I was never meant to be a caregiver. I was just the unwitting warden of their private prison. The universe has a strange way of offering a lifeline exactly when the water is closing over your head. Between the crushing weight of the newly discovered property theft and the physical exhaustion of lifting a paralyzed adult 20 times a day, my reality was fraying at the edges. The snapping point arrived on a humid Thursday evening in the form of a sharp, crackling electrical hiss. I had just plugged a cheap space heater into the living room wall when a bright blue spark shot out, followed instantly by the acrid, terrifying smell of melting plastic and ozone. Half the apartment plunged into darkness. I stood there in the sudden quiet, staring at the blackened outlet, entirely defeated. I did not have the money to call a professional repair company, but I remembered the quiet, broad-shouldered maintenance technician who always fixed the commercial fryers at the diner where I worked. His name was Evan Mercer. I called him from the diner's landline the next morning, my voice tight with panic, asking if he did cheap-side jobs. Evan showed up at my apartment exactly 2 hours later. He did not wear a crisp suit or carry a leather briefcase like the men in my family. He wore faded canvas warpants, heavy steel-toed boots, and a thick tool belt that clinked softly with every step. He was a man of incredibly few words. He walked straight to the blackened wall, knelt down, and got to work. But as he replaced the melted wires, I noticed his eye sweeping across the room. He saw the makeshift floor bed. He saw the heavy rusted wheelchair blocking the narrow hallway. He saw the sheer, unmanageable pressure of a living space that was completely hostile to a disabled person and her exhausted caretaker. The men in my life, specifically my father and my brother, were exceptionally talented at offering unsolicited, highly critical advice while doing absolutely nothing to help. They would tell me I needed to organize better, work harder, or simply stop complaining. Evan Mercer was the exact opposite. He finished fixing the outlet, packed his tools, and left without a word. But the very next afternoon, he knocked on my door again. This time he was carrying 3 heavy-duty stainless steel grab bars, a power drill, and a box of high-wattage light bulbs. He did not ask for permission, and he certainly did not ask for money. He just walked directly into my cramped, mildewed bathroom and spent the next hour anchoring the thick metal bars directly into the wall studs right next to the toilet and the shower. He then moved to the hallway, replacing the dim, flickering overhead light with a bright, steady bulb that eliminated all the dangerous shadows on the floor. Before he left, he stood in the kitchen and patiently taught me how to properly test the battery on the ancient smoke detector and how to organize the daily pillboxes so I would not accidentally double-dose my grandmother when I was severely sleep-deprived. Grandma Lorraine watched his every move. She possessed an incredibly sharp, critical gaze that could usually strip a person down to their bare flaws in seconds. For 2 days, she simply observed Evan as he moved quietly around our space, fixing things that were fundamentally broken. She noted how he always made sure his heavy boots did not scrape against her wheelchair when he passed by. She noticed that he never talked down to her or treated her like a deaf infant. On his third visit, as Evan was zipping up his canvas bag and turning toward the front door to leave, Grandma Lorraine lifted her good left hand. She brought her index finger down against the hard plastic of her tray table. A single distinct, deliberate tap. Evan paused, looking back at her with a slightly confused expression. I smiled, feeling a strange warm knot form in my chest. I explained to him that one tap meant she accepted him. In the strict silent language of my grandmother, that single sound was the highest possible honor a stranger could receive. Evan gave a small, respectful nod in her direction and quietly let himself out. The true depth of his character, however, revealed itself a week later. I had just returned from a brutal 14-hour double shift. My legs felt like they were filled with wet cement. I sat down at the small dining table, intending to sort out the evening blood pressure medications, but my eyes simply refused to stay open. My head dropped forward, resting on my crossed arms against the hard wood. I slipped into a heavy, dark sleep right there in the middle of the room. When I finally jolted awake, disoriented and panicking about the missed medication schedule, I realized two things. First, someone had gently draped a thick woven blanket over my shoulders. Second, the entire apartment smelled deeply of warm chicken broth and roasted garlic. I blinked the sleep from my eyes and turned around. Evan was standing by my small stove, stirring a steaming pot. He had used the spare key I had hidden under the mat to let himself in to check the radiator. Seeing me passed out, he simply took over. I watched in stunned silence as he carefully read the handwritten dosage schedule I had taped to the refrigerator door. He meticulously separated the small white pills from the blue capsules, placing them in a small paper cup exactly as I always did. He then poured a bowl of the hot soup, mashed the soft vegetables down so they were safe to swallow, and carried it over to Grandma Lorraine. He sat beside her, talking quietly about the weather while he helped her eat. For the first time in 29 years, I experienced the overwhelming, dizzying sensation of not having to fight the entire world completely alone. I felt a massive, heavy stone roll right off my chest. Later, that night, as we sat on the faded rug drinking cheap instant coffee, the dam finally broke. I told Evan absolutely everything. The words spilled out of me in a frantic, desperate rush. I told him about the hidden brass key wrapped in the old handkerchief. I told him about the suspicious tax documents, the newly formed real estate company, and the shocking revelation that my brother was quietly liquidating her entire estate. I described the aggressive, threatening phone calls from my parents and the sudden, suspicious visits where they only cared about getting her signature on legal papers. I fully expected him to be overwhelmed. I expected him to awkwardly pat my shoulder, tell me it was a complicated family issue, and slowly back away toward the door to escape the drama. But Evan just sat there, his large hands wrapped around his ceramic mug, digesting the heavy information. He did not try to play the glowing savior. He did not offer empty legal advice or tell me I needed to call the police immediately. He just looked at me with a calm, steady gaze and spoke a single, piercing truth that anchored everything into place. He said that people do not suddenly rush back to claim a silent, disabled old woman unless they are absolutely terrified she is still holding on to something they desperately need. His blunt assessment cut right through all the emotional manipulation my family had employed. It validated every paranoid instinct I had felt since the rainy night they dropped her off. But his quiet, steadfast presence also highlighted a deeply painful reality about my own life. Sitting across from this man who had asked for nothing, I realized that my personal standard for human decency had been beaten down to a heartbreakingly low level. I was completely mesmerized by someone simply treating me like a human being worthy of basic care. The atmosphere in the apartment fundamentally shifted after that night. The heavy dread was replaced by a quiet, determined preparation. And it was during this calm, sheltered period that something miraculous began to happen in the dead of night. It started as a faint scratching sound when the apartment was completely silent. I would lie awake on my floor mattress, listening to the dark from the corner of the room. Grandma Lorraine was practicing. She was forcing air through her damaged vocal cords. She only did it when she knew Evan was gone and the doors were locked tight against the outside world. It was a dry, raspy, agonizing effort. She was forming tiny, broken syllables, wrestling with her own paralyzed muscles to reclaim the power of speech. She was not just trying to communicate with me anymore. She was meticulously, silently forging a weapon. She was preparing herself for a massive, violent collision that I could not yet fully imagine, ensuring that when the time finally came to strike back at the people who threw us away, she would not be silent. The aggressive escalation began on a miserable Tuesday morning, delivered in the form of a thick cream-colored envelope slid silently under my apartment door. I was balancing a cup of cheap instant coffee and preparing for another exhausting 12-hour shift when I saw it resting on the faded rug. The return address belonged to one of the most expensive, ruthless corporate law firms in the entire city. When I tore open the heavy paper, the official legal notice inside felt like a physical strike to the chest. My family had completely abandoned their fake, polite negotiations. Because I had flatly refused to cooperate and hand over the brass key or force her to sign their vague documents, they changed their strategy to sheer intimidation. The formal letter was a petition threatening to strip me of any physical custody. The lawyers accused me of being entirely unfit to provide adequate medical care for a disabled senior citizen. They weaponized my poverty against me, citing my cramped square footage, my dangerously low annual income, and my grueling, unpredictable dual work schedule. They painted my desperate attempts to keep us both alive as deliberate, malicious negligence. But the legal threat was only the first wave of their coordinated assault. My mother, a master of social warfare, immediately launched a vicious whispering smear campaign across our entire extended family network. I began receiving hostile, angry voicemails from distant aunts and second cousins who had not bothered to speak to me in over 10 years. My mother had spun a tragic, completely fabricated narrative. She told everyone who would listen that I was holding our poor sick grandmother hostage in a filthy, dangerous slum, maliciously isolating her to extort the family estate for cash. I was suddenly being painted as a greedy, manipulative gold digger by the exact same people who had thrown her away like trash. The sheer blinding hypocrisy of the accusation made me physically nauseous. I was actively taking out high-interest payday loans and skipping my own dinners just to afford her premium adult diapers, her specialized soft food diet, and her expensive blood pressure medications. Meanwhile, my mother was sitting in the dining room of her exclusive country club, sipping expensive wine and telling her wealthy friends that I was a thief. My brother Nalan, true to his cowardly nature, publicly pretended to stand above the ugly legal drama. He played the role of the heartbroken, neutral peacekeeper to the rest of the family. But his pristine mask completely shattered because of a simple, careless clerical error. On Friday afternoon, my cheap cell phone rang with an unknown number. When I listened to the voicemail later that night, my blood ran completely cold. The caller was an admissions coordinator for a private, highly secured, long-term nursing facility located deep in the rural state of Indiana, nearly 400 miles away from our city. The cheerful woman stated she was calling to confirm the expedited involuntary transfer paperwork submitted by a Mr. Walsh, because my phone number was still listed as the primary emergency medical contact on my grandmother's original hospital charts. The facility's automated system had mistakenly routed the final confirmation call directly to me. Nolan was not just trying to take control of the money. He was actively plotting to legally kidnap her. He was trying to secretly ship a paralyzed woman across state lines in the middle of the night. He wanted to bury her in a remote, out-of-state facility where I could never reach her, making her permanently disappear before any court could officially audit the stolen property records. For about 20 minutes, sheer unadulterated panic completely consumed me. I sat on my bathroom floor, struggling to pull air into my lungs, staring blindly at the terrifying legal letter. I felt incredibly small, violently outmatched, and entirely alone. But then I looked out into the living room where Grandma Lorraine was resting quietly on her makeshift bed, completely dependent on my protection. The suffocating panic instantly burned away, leaving behind a cold, hard, and furious resolve. Instead of surrendering to their wealth and power, I immediately fought back the only way a poor person can. I bought a stack of cheap yellow spiral notebooks from the corner store and turned my entire existence into an ironclad, undeniable paper trail. I aggressively documented every single second of our lives. I logged the exact time of every pill she swallowed, every meal she ate, and every ounce of water she drank. I kept a meticulous, organized folder of every single grocery receipt and pharmacy bill. I used my cracked phone to record daily videos of her successfully completing her physical therapy exercises. Most importantly, I downloaded a hidden call recording application and captured every single screaming, unhinged, threatening phone call my mother made to me. When Evan Mercer came over to fix the leaking pipe under my sink and saw the terrifying legal letter sitting on my kitchen counter, he did not offer me empty, useless sympathy. He did not tell me everything would magically work out. He simply picked up his phone and made a single call. The very next morning, Evan drove me downtown to a cramped, chaotic legal aid office situated above a noisy laundromat. He introduced me to Mara King. Mara was a sharp, exhausted, brilliantly fierce civil rights attorney who had successfully helped Evan navigate a vicious guardianship dispute with his own estranged relatives years prior. Mara sat behind a desk completely buried in case files. She read the expensive legal threat from my family in less than 2 minutes. She tossed the paper back onto the desk, looked me dead in the eye, and bluntly decoded their exact strategy. Mara explained that my family was actively constructing a manufactured, highly distorted profile of psychological instability and financial ruin. They were building a negligence case to legally strip me of my rights, force me out of the picture, and seize total control of Grandma Lorraine's physical person. Mara told me there was exactly one way to permanently block an involuntary medical transfer to another state. We had to legally and medically prove that the patient was not the vacant, mindless shell my family claimed her to be. Following Mara's strict, urgent instructions, I spent over $400 of my borrowed rent money to hire an independent court-certified geriatric neurologist to conduct a full cognitive evaluation right inside my apartment. When the doctor arrived 2 days later, I was terrified the stress of a stranger would cause Grandma Lorraine to shut down completely, but I was entirely wrong. She had been waiting for this exact moment. She sat tall and rigid in her wheelchair, her eyes burning with intense focus. While she could not speak the words aloud, she navigated the complex medical assessment with terrifying, undeniable brilliance. When the doctor asked her to identify obscure objects, point to specific dates on a printed calendar, or solve basic logical sequencing puzzles, she used her good left hand to point, tap, and gesture with absolute unflinching precision. The neurologist was visibly stunned. He spent 2 hours with her before packing up his briefcase. He assured me he would note in his official medical report that while her vocal speech was severely impaired by the stroke, her cognitive reasoning, memory recall, and situational awareness were 100% intact. She understood absolutely everything happening around her. She was simply trapped inside a broken body. That preliminary medical report was a massive, impenetrable concrete shield. Mara instantly filed the documents with the county clerk, establishing an official record of lucidity that completely destroyed any legal attempt Nolan had made to force an out-of-state medical transfer. But securing that critical victory only escalated the immense danger we were in. By medically proving she was legally lucid, we had accidentally triggered my family's absolute worst nightmare. If she was of sound mind, then every single suspicious property deed, every altered trust document, and every financial transfer signed after her stroke could suddenly be challenged and ripped apart in an open court of law. The dark reality of their escalating panic became undeniable late that same night. I walked down the dim, flickering stairwell to the main lobby of my apartment building to check the mail after returning from my evening diner shift. I stopped dead in my tracks. The metal door of my designated mailbox was hanging wide open, twisted violently on its hinges. Someone had taken a heavy steel tool, likely a crowbar or a large screwdriver, and violently pried the lock completely out of the thin aluminum frame. The jagged metal edges were still sharp. The box was completely empty. I knew for a fact that nothing of value was missing except for a single thick unmarked envelope from the local bank that I had been tracking through the postal delivery application on my phone. It was a private financial statement meant exclusively for Grandma Lorraine. Someone had purposely broken into a federal mailbox just to steal her mail and monitor our counterattack. Standing in that freezing empty hallway, staring at the ruined metal lock, a cold shiver ran violently down my spine. I finally understood the terrifying scope of the situation. This was no longer just a bitter, emotional family feud over past resentments and neglected daughters. My parents and my brother were not just angry anymore. They were terrified, hunted criminals desperate to cover their tracks. This had officially transformed into a vicious high-stakes war for the absolute control of the truth, and they were clearly willing to step out of the shadows and commit serious crimes to ensure that the truth never got the chance to speak. The nights in my apartment used to be defined by the heavy oppressive silence of pure exhaustion. I would collapse onto my floor mattress, listening to the wind rattle the loose window panes, praying for just 4 hours of uninterrupted sleep before the next grueling shift at the diner. But deep into our 4th month together, that predictable silence was violently broken. It began as a faint scraping sound coming from her corner of the room. I initially thought she was choking on her own saliva. I scrambled across the cold floorboards in the pitch black, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. But when I reached her makeshift bed, Grandma Lorraine was not in physical distress. Her eyes were wide, sharply focused, and burning with a terrifying, deliberate intensity. She was staring directly at me, the delicate muscles in her frail neck straining against an invisible weight. Her jaw trembled violently. She took a ragged, incredibly shallow breath, forcing air through vocal cords that had been essentially paralyzed for nearly a year. "No," she rasped. The sound was harsh, guttural, sounding exactly like two heavy, dry stones grinding together. She closed her eyes, gathering her fading strength, and pushed out another broken piece of sound. "Tras Nullan." I sat completely frozen on the faded rug, my hands shaking uncontrollably. Over the next several weeks, these midnight sessions became our absolute guarded secret. She never uttered a single sound during the daylight hours, especially not when Evan Mercer was visiting or when the hallway outside felt too busy. She only spoke in the dead of night, trusting the darkness to hide her miraculous, agonizing recovery from the rest of the world. I bought a cheap yellow spiral notebook from the corner store and sat beside her on the floor, acting as her silent, dedicated scribe. From her fractured syllables and exhausted breaths, I slowly pieced together a terrifying, infuriating mosaic of the recent past. "House," she whispered one evening, gripping my wrist so tightly her nails dug into my skin. "Not sold, stolen." On another quiet night, after taking her blood pressure medication, she managed to connect 3 vital concepts that cracked the entire case wide open. Ledger, bank box, gench. It took nearly 3 weeks of patient, painful transcription to construct the full timeline of the months leading up to her catastrophic medical emergency, long before the massive stroke ever hit her. Her sharp business instincts had already caught the foul, undeniable scent of my family's greed. She had noticed glaring discrepancies in her quarterly financial statements. She deeply suspected that my brother Nalan was quietly siphoning funds and using her massive private investment portfolios as illegal collateral to secure high-risk commercial loans for his failing downtown real estate project. When she finally confronted my father about his golden boy, she did not receive a tearful apology or an explanation. Instead, she faced a highly coordinated, suffocating campaign of psychological and emotional warfare. My father begged her not to ruin his son's bright future over a simple, easily fixable misunderstanding. He aggressively weaponized family loyalty against her, claiming she was abandoning her own blood. My mother, playing the role of the practical enforcer, relentlessly shoved thick stacks of complex asset restructuring documents onto her lap during Sunday dinners. My mother claimed it was merely a defensive maneuver, a completely necessary legal step to reduce their brutal tax liabilities and protect the wealthy family legacy from government overreach. But Grandma Elrain was never a fool. She flatly refused to sign the final critical pages that would legally hand over total executive control of her wealth to Nalan. While my parents and my brother arrogantly believed they were slowly wearing her down through sheer repetition, she was quietly, ruthlessly fighting back in the shadows. She secretly arranged private meetings with her original longtime estate lawyer. She drastically altered her last will and testament, effectively cutting Nalan out of the primary financial distribution. She permanently locked down her largest liquid accounts and constructed a hidden ironclad layer of legal protection that they could not easily penetrate. The small brass key she had handed me weeks ago was the final anchor of that hidden defense. She was merely days away from finalizing a complete legal trap to expose their massive financial crimes when the stroke hit her brain like a lightning bolt. It stole the right side of her body and completely severed her ability to speak. When my family rushed into her sterile hospital room and saw a paralyzed, silent woman who could not form a single coherent sentence, they did not mourn the loss of their matriarch. They immediately celebrated a silent, gruesome victory. They assumed the war was permanently over. They believed they had won by default, completely unaware of the traps she had already set in motion. However, the most shattering revelation of all did not revolve around stolen real estate, forged signatures, or hidden bank accounts. It arrived on a quiet, freezing Sunday night while I was gently wiping her face with a warm, damp cloth. She looked at me, her chest heaving slightly as she gathered her strength for a long confession. She admitted in broken, raspy breaths that her physical recovery had actually started several weeks ago. She could have made sounds when my mother called my cell phone to scream at me. She could have grunted or fought back when Nalan stood in my living room spinning his intricate, manipulative lies. But she made a conscious, chilling choice to remain entirely mute. She wanted them to confidently believe she was a vacant shell. She wanted to see exactly who they truly were when they believed she possessed absolutely zero value and could no longer fight back. She used her silence as a mirror to reflect their pure, unfiltered greed. A sharp, agonizing sting hit the very center of my chest. The air in the room suddenly felt incredibly thin and impossible to breathe. I realized with a sickening drop in my stomach that I had been trapped inside that exact same brutal test. I had been dragging my exhausted body through double shifts, skipping my own meals to buy her soft food, sleeping on the hard wooden floor, and fighting off vicious legal threats from expensive lawyers, all while she quietly watched from her wheelchair, actively judging my true intentions. For 29 years, my family had treated me like a disposable backup plan, a person only worthy of attention when they needed to extract a favor. Now, I felt a sudden rush of bitter tears burning the corners of my eyes. Realizing my own grandmother had also viewed me as a potential enemy trying to steal from her, I pulled my hand away from her face, feeling incredibly small, betrayed, and deeply manipulated. But before I could stand up and walk away into the kitchen to hide my tears, her good left hand shot out. She grabbed my arm with a desperate, fierce strength I had never felt from her before. She pulled me back down to the floor, forcing me to look directly into her sharp, clear blue eyes. She took a deep, shuddering breath, completely bypassing the broken single syllables she had been using for weeks. With agonizing effort, her jaw trembling violently, she pushed out a single, complete and perfectly clear sentence. "You are the only one who did not come because you wanted to take." The raw, naked truth in her trembling voice hit me like a physical blow. The lingering hurt and deep resentment inside my chest dissolved instantly, replaced by a profound, overwhelming clarity. I was not just another disposable pawn in her grand strategic game. I was the only person in our entire bloodline who had genuinely passed the ultimate test of basic humanity. She had not stayed silent to punish me. She had stayed silent to be absolutely certain she could trust me with her life. From that exact moment onward, the dynamic between us fundamentally shifted. We were no longer just a desperate, broke granddaughter and a discarded, disabled grandmother clinging to each other out of sheer family obligation and basic survival. We became a forged, permanent, and silent alliance. The quiet, dark nights in my cramped apartment were no longer filled with exhausting fear or crushing anxiety about the future. They officially became our private war room. We spent our evenings meticulously sharpening our legal weapons, quietly gathering every single shred of evidence with Mara. We were patiently, ruthlessly preparing for the exact right moment to drag my entire family out of their pristine, wealthy shadows and force them to face the absolute destruction of everything they had stolen. The invitation arrived not with a harsh legal threat, but with a terrifyingly polite phone call. My mother's voice flowed through the receiver, smooth and sweet, adopting a warm tone I had not heard directed at me since I was a small child. She proposed a peaceful private family reconciliation dinner. She insisted that all of this ugly, embarrassing legal tension had simply gone too far, and we desperately needed to sit down like civilized adults before dragging our private business into a public courtroom. She deliberately chose an incredibly exclusive, outrageously expensive French restaurant located far out in the affluent western suburbs, a place where the ambient noise consisted entirely of clinking crystal glasses and hushed, wealthy conversations. Mara Keene, sitting behind her cluttered legal desk, immediately warned me it was a highly orchestrated trap. She told me my family was desperately trying to change the battlefield from a sterile, legal environment where they were losing ground to a social cage where they held all the emotional leverage. I fully intended to decline the invitation immediately, but when I returned to the apartment and relayed the message, Grandma Lorraine shook her head. Sitting in the dim light of my living room, she used her newfound raspy voice to issue a direct command. She wanted to go. She explicitly stated it was time to look every single one of them directly in the eyes while they still foolishly believed they controlled the stage. On the evening of the dinner, Evan Mercer came over to help me carefully lift her into the passenger seat of my rusted failing sedan. I wore my only decent black dress, while Grandma wore a pressed navy blouse I had bought with my last few spare dollars. When we arrived at the restaurant, the sharply dressed valet looked at my battered car with deep disdain before reluctantly taking the keys. I pushed the heavy, squeaking wheelchair over the plush, dark crimson carpets of the dining room, feeling the judgmental eyes of the host upon us. They were already seated at a large round booth in the most secluded private corner of the room. My mother wore a pristine white silk blouse, radiating an aura of untouchable, effortless wealth. My father sat stiffly in a tailored dark suit, while Nolan wore his signature charismatic, dangerous smile. They looked exactly like a florless, perfect family featured in a glossy luxury magazine. The contrast between their polished elegance and my exhausted, frayed appearance was entirely deliberate. They wanted me to feel utterly outclassed and completely overwhelmed before a single word was ever spoken. For the first 45 minutes, their performance was completely flawless. Nolan took the conversational lead, playing the role of the deeply burdened, misunderstood visionary over plates of roasted duck and glasses of incredibly expensive red wine. He launched into a smooth, deeply practiced monologue. He actually apologized for the immense stress of the past several months. He masterfully shifted the blame away from his own greed, attributing his aggressive legal maneuvers to the highly volatile commercial real estate market and the crushing weight of his massive business debts. He placed a hand over his heart and swore to me that every single harsh action he took was strictly designed to preserve the Walsh family assets for our future generations. He sounded so incredibly genuine and heartbroken that for a fleeting fraction of a second a naive person might have actually believed him. Throughout Nolan's entire theatrical performance, my father remained entirely silent. He methodically cut his steak, chewing slowly, his dark eyes tracking every single micro-expression on my face. His silence was not a sign of surrender or agreement. It was the terrifying quiet of a predator waiting in the tall grass. I realized with a sickening clarity that he was acting as the final closer. He was letting Nolan soften the ground, waiting patiently for me to show a single crack of emotional exhaustion before he dropped the final crushing trap on my head. As the waiter silently cleared our empty plates, the polite facade finally dissolved into the true business of the evening. My father wiped his mouth with a crisp linen napkin, leaned forward, and laid out their ultimate proposal. His voice was low, reasonable, and entirely devoid of any actual warmth. He announced that they had secured a permanent, highly exclusive spot for Grandma El Rain in a state-of-the-art luxury care facility up north. In exchange for my complete, unquestioning cooperation, they were prepared to be incredibly generous. My father promised to instantly pay off every single penny of my crippling college debt. Furthermore, he offered me a massive life-changing lump sum of cash, assuring me it was enough money to let me quit my miserable diner job and start completely over. All I had to do was sign a single legal document renouncing all of my rights to intervene in her medical or financial affairs. They were trying to buy me out. They were offering to purchase their freedom with the exact same stolen money they were desperately trying to hide. Before I could even open my mouth to reject the disgusting bribe, Nolan executed his most sinister move of the entire night. He reached inside his tailored jacket and pulled out a sleek dark leather folder. He did not hand it to me. Instead, he slid the thick stack of legal papers directly across the crisp white tablecloth until it rested right in front of Grandma Lorraine. He pulled a heavy gold fountain pen from his pocket and placed it deliberately beside the documents. Nolan leaned over the table, using the hushed, crowded atmosphere of the high-end restaurant as a psychological weapon. He knew I would not cause a screaming scene in a place like this. He looked at the silent, paralyzed woman in the wheelchair, adopting the sickeningly sweet, condescending tone meant for a slow toddler. He told her not to worry about trying to speak or understand the complex legal words. He smoothly suggested that if she agreed with his brilliant plan to save the family, all she had to do was simply nod her head, and he would physically help her guide the pen across the signature line. It was an incredibly refined public version of the exact same manipulation they had tried back in my miserable apartment for 10 agonizing seconds. The table descended into absolute suffocating silence. The soft jazz playing through the overhead speakers seemed to fade entirely away. My mother held her breath. My father stared intently at the gold pen. Nolan kept his bright, expectant smile perfectly frozen in place, waiting for his victory. Then the ground completely fell out from beneath them. Grandma Lorraine did not look at the pen. She did not look at the legal papers. She sat up perfectly straight, pulling her spine away from the back of the wheelchair with a sudden rigid strength. She slowly turned her head, fixing her sharp, predatory blue eyes directly onto my brother's face. She opened her mouth. She did not struggle. She did not gasp for air or hesitate. The voice she had been meticulously, painfully honing in the dark corners of my apartment for weeks cut through the elegant dining room like a serrated hunting knife. "Do you still think I am the stupidest person at this table, Nolan?" Her voice was sharp, steady, and dripping with an ancient, terrifying venom. The words were perfectly articulated, carrying over the ambient noise of the restaurant and landing like a physical bomb squarely in the center of our table. The reaction was instantaneous and utterly catastrophic. Total, absolute paralysis gripped my family. My father violently flinched, his heavy silver dessert fork slipping right through his fingers. It crashed loudly against his fine china plate, the sharp clatter echoing across the quiet dining room. My mother's face instantly drained of all human color, turning a horrifying ashen shade of gray as she stared in sheer terror at the woman she had confidently told the world was a mindless vegetable. Nolan completely froze. His charismatic smile shattered into a million jagged pieces, his mouth hanging slightly open as his brain entirely failed to process the impossible reality unfolding right in front of him. At the adjacent tables, several wealthy patrons paused their conversations, turning their heads to look at the sudden, suffocating tension radiating from our booth. But Grandma Lorraine did not offer them a grand screaming monologue. She did not curse my parents or proudly explain her miraculous recovery. She had delivered her single devastating strike, and she knew exactly when to walk away from the battlefield while they were bleeding without breaking her fierce eye contact with my utterly destroyed brother. She lifted her good left hand and tapped my wrist twice. It was our established silent signal to leave. I stood up slowly, my heart pounding a violent, triumphant rhythm against my ribs. I grabbed the heavy rubber handles of her rusted wheelchair, pulling her safely back from the pristine white tablecloth. I did not say a single word of goodbye to the people who raised me. I simply turned us around and pushed her toward the exit, leaving the three of them drowning in a toxic sea of their own profound humiliation and blinding panic. As the heavy glass doors of the restaurant closed behind us, blocking out the stunned silence of my family, I knew with absolute certainty that this was not the end of the war. That single terrifying sentence was merely the opening gunshot. 72 hours after the catastrophic dinner at the French restaurant, the legal machinery slammed into high gear. Mara Keene, working relentlessly from her cramped office, successfully tracked down Grandmar Elrain's original estate attorney. He was an incredibly sharp, elderly man who had been completely shut out and falsely informed by my parents that his client was permanently incapacitated and medically unable to receive visitors. Armed with the small brass key and the newly certified medical affidavit proving her cognitive lucidity, the two lawyers walked directly into the Rivermark Savings branch, bypassing the terrified teller who had previously turned me away. They presented the ironclad court orders and legally forced the vault open. I sat in Mara's office late the following afternoon, staring in absolute silence at the contents of the steel box spread across her battered wooden desk. There were no glittering family heirlooms or sentimental photographs. There were only thick stacks of aged, heavy paper that held enough explosive power to permanently level my family's entire pristine empire. Mara methodically walked me through the documents, translating the dense legal jargon into plain, horrifying English. The first layer of the box contained a secondary hidden financial ledger and a series of meticulously handwritten notes detailing secret, unauthorized transactions. Then Mara unfolded the altered property transfer contracts, finally exposing the complete sickening anatomy of the theft. My family had not merely sold her sprawling the historic estate below market value to a random shell company. The scheme was far more malicious and desperate than a simple fire sale. Nolan and my father had utilized the fraudulently transferred deed to aggressively leverage the property. They had taken the house my grandfather built, appraised it at maximum commercial value, and secured a massive high-interest corporate mortgage directly through Walden Crest redevelopment. They had literally hollowed out her safe haven, illegally draining millions of dollars in liquid cash to desperately plug the rapidly sinking hole of Nolan's disastrous downtown commercial project. They had deliberately turned the roof over her head into a temporary disposable life raft to save their own colossal failures. But the most devastating piece of paper resting inside the steel box was a completely unannounced hidden trust addendum. It revealed a separate massive investment portfolio that had been quietly generating compound interest for nearly 3 decades. My late grandfather had specifically established it years ago with an ironclad, secretive stipulation. He had possessed the foresight to see the creeping rot of greed in his own son. He designed the blind trust entirely to prevent my father from recklessly squandering the foundational wealth if his financial habits ever spiraled out of control. It was a financial dead man's switch invisible to my parents' aggressive accountants, and Grandma Lorraine had possessed the absolute final say over its distribution. As Mara read the final pages of the updated trust documents, the air in the small office suddenly grew incredibly thin. My eyes scanned the legal phrasing, and a cold, heavy knot formed deep in my stomach. I was explicitly named in these recent updates, but I was not listed as a beloved pre-selected primary heir receiving a magical unconditional payout. Instead, the document designated me as the ultimate executive and sole beneficiary on one incredibly strict, terrifying condition. The dense legal language dictated that the transfer of power would only trigger if I successfully took physical custody of her and provided sustained adequate care without ever attempting to coerce, manipulate, or force her to alter her financial decisions. The words blurred together on the page. My entire reality tilted violently on its axis. I had not been chosen because of some grand predestined family justice or unconditional trust. I had been dropped directly into a brutal high-stakes moral obstacle course without my knowledge or consent for months, while I was drowning in suffocating debt, losing my hair from stress, eating cheap noodles, and fighting off vicious legal threats from my own parents. I was secretly being audited. I did not feel victorious knowing I was standing on top of a hidden gold mine. I felt profoundly, deeply violated. I abruptly left Mara's office, drove my rusted sedan back to the apartment, and walked straight into the living room. Grandma Lorraine was sitting in her wheelchair by the window, watching the afternoon rain hit the glass. I threw my damp coat onto the floor, the heavy silence of the room shattering as my anger finally boiled over. Hot, bitter tears streamed down my face. I stood over her and demanded to know why. I asked her how she could possibly sit there in that rusted chair, watching me destroy my own physical and mental health while she put me through a psychological meat grinder. I screamed that my entire life, for 29 agonizing years, my parents had forced me to constantly prove my basic worth, treating me like an ungrateful burden who was never quite good enough. And now, the one person I genuinely thought was different, the one person I had sacrificed my last shred of sanity to protect, had been secretly scoring my morality the entire time. She did not flinch away from my rage. She did not cry, and she did not offer a soft, pathetic, emotionally manipulative excuse. She looked up at me with a stark, brutal honesty that stripped away the very last remaining illusions of our complicated, toxic family dynamic. Her raspy, grinding voice filled the quiet room, echoing against the peeling wallpaper. She openly admitted it was a cruel, unforgiving test. She called it the bitter, paranoid mistake of an old woman who had survived far too long in a house full of venomous, greedy people. She explained that when you spend 4 decades watching your own flesh and blood use affection purely as a transactional bargaining chip to extract wealth, you lose the fundamental ability to blindly trust anyone. You begin to view every single act of kindness as a concealed weapon. She confessed that when they dumped her at my door, she genuinely believed I would eventually crack under the pressure and demand her signature just to free myself from the burden. It was a raw, deeply uncomfortable apology, delivered not with the weakness of a fragile elder, but with the rare bleeding truth of a hardened survivor. I stood there, my chest heaving, listening to the steady rhythm of the rain hitting the glass pane. She slowly reached out her good left hand, her knuckles pale and trembling slightly from the effort. She told me that she had fully expected me to fail, just like the rest of them always did, but I had stayed. She looked up at me, her sharp blue eyes piercing right through the thick layers of my anger. She said she did not choose me because I was an obedient, easily manipulated backup daughter who always followed the rules. She chose me because I was the absolute only person in her entire life who knew exactly how to give everything when nobody was watching, and when there was absolutely nothing left to gain. The heavy, suffocating resentment that had built up inside my chest finally broke, washing away into the quiet air of the apartment. I slowly crossed the short distance between us and firmly took her trembling hand. In that silent, incredibly powerful moment, the lingering ghosts of our family's manipulation were completely banished from the room. We were no longer testing each other. Later, that evening, as I was preparing her evening medication, my phone vibrated loudly against the kitchen counter. It was a long text message from Mara. The preparation phase of our war was officially over. The documentary evidence we had pulled from the bank vault was airtight, fully authenticated, and thoroughly catalogued. Mara's message was brief, but terrifyingly clear regarding the immediate future. We now possessed enough hard, financial ammunition to trigger a massive federal-scale fraud investigation. Mara noted that we were holding a loaded gun to the head of my brother's entire career. If Nolan decided to launch a counterattack in probate court to seize custody, the resulting explosion from our evidence would completely vaporize his public standing, and the undeniable paper trail would instantly drag both of my parents down into the criminal wreckage right alongside him. We were no longer hiding in the dark. We were holding all the matches, and we were finally ready to burn their house down. My brother Nolan never knew how to retreat gracefully, so he decided to strike first. exactly 72 hours after the disastrous dinner at the French restaurant. A process server handed me a thick stack of legal documents. Outside my apartment building, Nolan had officially filed a massive petition in county probate court. He was aggressively suing for emergency physical custody of our grandmother and total legal control over her entire estate. His strategy was as predictable as it was disgusting. His expensive legal team crafted a vicious narrative painting me as a desperate, manipulative opportunist. They leaned heavily into my poverty, portraying a 29-year-old college dropout living in a run-down, cramped slum who had maliciously isolated a severely brain-damaged senior citizen to steal her remaining wealth. Nolan walked into the courthouse on the morning of the decisive hearing wearing a custom-tailored suit that easily cost $5,000, projecting the aura of a heartbroken, responsible grandson simply trying to save his family. My parents sat directly behind him in the gallery, radiating smug, untouchable confidence. They genuinely believed my cheap clothes and dark circles under my eyes would make the judge view me as a failure. They were entirely unprepared for Mara Keene. When the judge called our case, Mara did not play defense. She stepped up to the podium and unleashed an absolute legal massacre. She started by entering the independent court-certified neurological evaluation into the official public record, medically proving with 100% certainty that Grandma Lorraine possessed full cognitive lucidity. Then Mara systematically dismantled their accusations of neglect. She submitted 6 yellow spiral notebooks filled with my meticulous daily care logs, 4 dozen pharmacy receipts, and hours of time-stamped video evidence showing Grandma Lorraine successfully completing her physical therapy exercises in my living room. Nolan's lawyer tried to object, claiming the medical reports were somehow biased, but Mara was just getting started. She pivoted instantly to the financial motive, projecting the heavily guarded documents we had extracted from the bank vault directly onto the courtroom monitors. She laid out the entire sickening anatomy of Walden Crest redevelopment. She showed the judge the exact paper trail proving how my family had illegally transferred the deed to Grandma Lorraine's historic home for zero, aggressively mortgaged it against its maximum commercial value, and funneled millions of dollars in stolen equity directly into Nolan's failing downtown commercial project. She highlighted my father's name, printed in stark black ink, listing him as a senior strategic advisor to the fraudulent shell company. The color began to violently drain from my brother's face. My mother gripped the wooden bench in front of her so tightly her knuckles turned completely white. Nolan's attorney panicked, standing up and loudly arguing that the financial documents were outdated and that Grandma Lorraine was far too medically fragile to verify any of these wild claims. He demanded the case be immediately sealed. That was the exact moment the entire dynamic of my family shattered forever. I leaned down and firmly locked the heavy metal brakes on the rusted wheelchair. I stepped back. The entire courtroom went dead silent as Grandma Lorraine placed her good left hand on the armrest. Her arm trembled violently under her own weight, but she pushed. She fought against a year of paralysis, forcing her spine straight, and she stood up on her own 2 feet. The judge stared in sheer disbelief. My father let out a choked, audible gasp from the gallery. Grandma Lorraine looked directly at the man in the black robe. Her voice was not entirely smooth. It still carried the rough, grinding texture of her long recovery, but the absolute razor-sharp clarity of her words echoed off the high ceiling. She methodically dismantled every single lie her son and grandson had built over the last 2 years. She testified that Nolan and my father had subjected her to relentless, suffocating psychological abuse to force her to sign away her legacy. She publicly named my mother as the primary architect of her physical isolation, detailing how my mother had systematically cut off all communication with her trusted friends and original legal counsel. Nolan frantically interrupted, stammering to the judge that she was clearly confused and suffering from severe stroke-induced delusions. He swore on his wife that he had never once tried to access her private trust accounts without her explicit, loving permission. Mara smiled a cold, terrifying smile. She turned to the judge and introduced our final, completely undeniable exhibit. It was a digital video file subpoena directly from Rivermark Savings. The courtroom monitors flickered to life, displaying crisp internal security footage from exactly 3 weeks ago. The video clearly showed Nolan standing in the bank lobby, his face flushed red with rage, screaming at a terrified bank teller and aggressively slamming forged power of attorney documents against the marble counter as he desperately tried to illegally crack into her hidden investment portfolio. It was the ultimate objective kill shot. The video completely vaporized the pristine, heartbroken savior persona he had spent his entire life perfecting. Nolan's emergency petition collapsed instantly. The judge did not just rule in our favor. He immediately referred the entire Walsh family to the district attorney's office for a massive multi-agency criminal investigation into corporate wire fraud, real estate fraud, and severe elder abuse. My father was publicly fired from his prestigious consulting firm less than 48 hours later. My mother was dragged into a humiliating, highly publicized civil probe for her direct participation in transferring the fraudulent legal papers. Their carefully curated, wealthy social empire burned to the ground in a matter of days. The court officially recognized Grandma Thelrain's updated trust, granting me absolute legal authority over her medical care and the total management of her recovered assets. But the most profound, life-altering shift had absolutely nothing to do with the millions of dollars that were suddenly sitting in a secure account under my name. For the first time in 29 years, I was no longer the disposable, invisible daughter left behind in the dark to clean up the catastrophic wreckage of my family's greed. 2 months later, we packed up the few things we actually cared about and permanently walked away from that miserable, drafty apartment. Using the legally recovered funds, I purchased a beautiful, modest single-story house in a quiet green suburb of Ohio. It had wide, accessible hallways, a massive kitchen with low counters, and a sprawling wrap-hound wooden front porch. Evan Mercer drove the moving truck. He carried the boxes inside, fixed the hinges on the back door, and set up the living room furniture. He did not stick around because I was suddenly a wealthy woman managing a massive trust fund. Evan stayed because he was the exact same man who had quietly stood by my side when my entire existence smelled exclusively of cheap antiseptic, stale instant noodles, and total despair. The war was finally over. The first morning in our new home was incredibly bright and peaceful. The air smelled of fresh pine and damp earth. I walked out onto the wooden front porch carrying 2 cups of hot coffee. Grandma Lorraine was already sitting there in the warm morning sun, her wheelchair parked next to a large ceramic planter. She was holding a small paper packet of tomato seeds in her left hand, gently turning them over, getting ready to plant a garden for the first time in over a year. I handed her the coffee and pulled the shiny new brass house key from my pocket, placing it gently on the wooden table between us. She looked at the key, then slowly looked up at me. The harsh, guarded edge that had defined her eyes for so long was completely gone. She smiled, took a slow sip of her coffee, and spoke the exact words I had unknowingly waited my entire life to hear. They left their mother at your door, but you are the family. Thank you all so much for listening to my story today. Please drop a comment down below and let me know where you are listening from so we can interact and share our thoughts together. Don't forget to subscribe to the Azad Revenge Stories channel. Leave a like on this video and support us even more by hitting that hype button so this story can be heard by many more people. Thanks to all.